Obinna stood in the dark, his heart pounding like the pestle against the mortar in his wife's hands earlier that day. She had tried to smash the last handful of cassava flakes into something edible for their 3 children, but even that had failed. There was nothing left, not even hope. His youngest child, barely 4 years old, had clung to his leg, crying weakly, "Papa, I'm hungry," before falling asleep on an empty stomach. Obinna had sworn to himself that night, "I will not let my family starve." That was how he found himself here, on his elder brother Kenichukwu's farm, clutching a cutlass and a bag, with the moonlight as his only companion. Kenichukwu's farm was the pride of the village. The tallest palm trees stood like soldiers guarding the rich soil, their fronds swaying lazily in the gentle night breeze. Obinna knew the layout of the farm like the back of his hand. As boys, he and Kenichukwu had worked side by side, climbing these same trees, cracking jokes, and dreaming of a better future. But life had taken them on different paths. Kenichukwu had prospered, while Obinna had struggled to keep his head above water. Tonight, though, there was no time for anything. His family needed food. With each step, the dry grass crunched softly under his feet. He moved quickly, like a thief in his own village, his eyes darting in every direction. What if someone saw him? What if Kenichukwu found out? Obinna shook his head and pushed the thoughts aside. He had no choice. His children's faces and his wife's silent tears haunted him. His brother had plenty. What was a few bunches of palm fruits compared to a starving family? He stopped at one of the taller trees and set down his bag, and for a moment, the farm seemed almost magical. But Obinna had no time to admire the beauty of the night. He wrapped his legs around the rough tree trunk and began to climb, his cutlass tied to his waist, tinkling softly with each movement. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the cool air. Every scratch of the tree covering against his skin reminded him of how his family was going to feed. When he reached the top, he paused, catching his breath. He scanned the place, ensuring no one was coming, then went to work. With ease, he swung the cutlass at the fruit bunches until they tumbled to the ground. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night, and Obinna was shocked. Too loud. "Hurry up," he told himself. As he climbed down the tree, his mind raced. He would sell the fruits at the market the next morning, buy Gary and perhaps a small fish if the money stretched far enough. He bent to gather the fruits into his bag when a voice shattered the silence. "Obinna." The name froze him in place. His heart dropped to his stomach as he slowly turned. Standing a few feet away was Kenichukwu, holding a double-barrel shotgun. The moonlight fell on his face, highlighting the fury in his eyes. Obinna had seen his brother angry before, but never like this. Kenichukwu looked like a hunter who had cornered his target. "Keen, Obinna stammered, his voice trembling. He dropped the bag, raising his hands as if to surrender. "Please, let me explain." Kenichukwu stepped closer, the shotgun still on him. "Explain what?" he barked. His voice was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. "That you're stealing from me? That my own blood would betray me like this?" Obinna felt tears sting his eyes. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to do this, Keen. I had no choice." "No choice." Kenichukwu's voice was cold, but his hands were steady as he held the gun. "You could have come to me, Obinna. You could have asked for help. But instead, you sneak onto my farm like a common thief. Do you know what this means in our culture? Do you know the shame you've brought on yourself?" Obinna dropped to his knees, his hands held together. "I know, brother, I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But my children, they haven't eaten in days. Amaka, my wife, she cried herself to sleep tonight because she couldn't feed them. What was I supposed to do? Watch them starve?" For a moment, Kenichukwu's expression faltered. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, but his eyes remained hard. "So, you thought stealing from me was the solution?" You thought you could just take what you didn't earn? Obinna nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, Keen. I thought that. I was desperate. I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make it right, but please don't punish me for trying to save my family. Kenichukwu stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets. Finally, Kenichukwu lowered the gun slightly, though his face remained unreadable. Stand up, he said. Obinna hesitated, unsure if this was a trap. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his knees shaking. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, avoiding his brother's piercing gaze. Pick up the bag, Kenichukwu said, his voice still firm. Obinna obeyed, lifting the heavy sack onto his shoulder. He waited for his brother to speak, his heart pounding. Kenichukwu took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Obinna's face. You will come with me, he said. We'll settle this at home. Obinna's stomach turned. He didn't know what that meant, but he knew better than to argue. He followed his brother out of the farm, the weight of the bag digging into his shoulder and the weight of his shame pressing on his heart. The night seemed darker now, the moon hiding behind a thick cloud. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was judging him. When they reached the edge of the farm, Kenichukwu stopped. Do you know what would have happened if someone else had caught you? He asked, his voice low. Do you know what the villagers would say if they found out? Obinna nodded, unable to speak. He knew. Thieves were not tolerated in their community, especially those who stole from family. The shame alone could destroy him, and the punishment would be even worse. Let's go, Kenichukwu said, his tone softer now. We'll talk at home. As they walked in silence, Obinna's mind raced. What would Kenichukwu do? Would he forgive him, or would he expose him? And what would happen to his family if the truth came out? The tension between the brothers was as thick as the night. Obinna's mind raced as they walked through the quiet farmland. His brother's words, "We'll talk at home," repeated in his head, but he couldn't trust them. Kenichukwu's grip on the shotgun hadn't loosened completely, and his face was still hard with anger. Fear gripped Obinna's heart like a vice. If Kenichukwu decided to turn him over to the villagers, he would never survive the shame or the punishment. As they approached a bend in the narrow dirt path leading back to the village, Obinna's legs began to tremble. What if he hands me over? What about my wife and children? The thought of leaving them behind without a father pushed him into a reckless decision. Suddenly, without thinking, Obinna dropped the bag of palm fruits and broke into a desperate run. His feet pounded against the earth as he tore through the bushes, his only thought being escape. His brother's voice roared behind him, "Obinna, stop!" But Obinna didn't stop. His bare feet stumbled over roots and rocks, and thorns scraped his legs, but he pushed on, his lungs burning. His only goal was to disappear into the night, to avoid the shame and save his family from more suffering. A loud bang shattered the silence. The sound was deafening, and it echoed through the trees. Obinna felt a hot, searing pain in his back. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell face first into the dirt. He tried to crawl, but his body refused to obey. The world around him began to spin, and the last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the blurry outline of his brother, standing over him with the shotgun. Kenichukwu froze, the gun still in his hands, his chest heaving. His heart thudded painfully as he stared at his brother's limp body on the ground. "Obinna," he called, but there was no response. Panic gripped him like a vice. He dropped to his knees and shook his brother's shoulders. Blood seeped into the earth beneath Obinna. "What have I done?" Kenichukwu whispered, his voice trembling. He hadn't meant to pull the trigger. He had only wanted to scare Obinna, to stop him from running. Now, his brother lay motionless, the life drained out of him. Fear clawed at Kenichukwu's chest. What if someone heard the gunshot? What if the villagers found out? He would be ruined. His name would be dragged through the mud, and he would never be able to live with the shame of killing his own brother. Desperation took over. He had to leave immediately without thinking. Kenichukwu grabbed the shotgun and stumbled away from the scene, his hands trembling. His palms were sticky with blood, but he didn't stop to clean them. He ran as fast as he could, the cool night air biting at his face. He didn't look back. By the time Kenichukwu reached his home, his breath was ragged, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. He locked the door behind him and sank into a chair, his mind racing. His hands still trembled as he stared down at them. They were stained with blood, Obinna's blood. He grabbed a cloth and tried to wipe them clean, but the stains seemed to cling to his skin. No matter how hard he scrubbed, the red marks refused to fade. It's just your imagination, he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. But deep down, he felt a strange, unshakable weight pressing down on him. The hours dragged by, and Kenichukwu couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Obinna's face, first filled with fear, then lifeless on the ground. Guilt chewed at his soul like a hungry rat. He told himself it wasn't his fault. Obinna had made the choice to steal. But no matter how much he tried to shift the blame, the bloodstains on his hands were a constant reminder of what he had done. The next morning, Kenichukwu's wife entered the room, frowning. "Kenichukwu, are you okay? You look faded." "I'm fine," he said quickly, hiding his hands under the table. "Just tired." She studied him for a moment, but before she could press further, there was a knock on the door and she left for her room. Kenichukwu's heart skipped a beat. He felt like a trapped animal as he rose to answer it. When he opened the door, he was met by a young boy from the village. "Uncle Keen," the boy said nervously, they found Obinna in the bush. He's dead." The words hit Kenichukwu like a sledgehammer. His knees almost gave way. He struggled to find his voice. What are you saying?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Some hunters found him this morning. They said it looked like he was shot. The village elders are already talking about it. They're asking questions." Kenichukwu nodded stiffly, dismissing the boy. As soon as the door closed, he leaned against it, his chest heaving. They had found Obinna's body. The whole village would soon know. He looked down at his hands again. The bloodstains were still there, glaring at him, mocking him. He grabbed a bowl of water and scrubbed furiously, his nails digging into his skin, but the stains wouldn't fade. He could feel the guilt etched into his very flesh. When his wife re-entered the room, he quickly hid his hands behind his back. "What's wrong, Kenichukwu?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you acting so strange?" "Nothing," he said, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The bloodstains were a constant reminder of his crime, and no matter how much he tried to pretend otherwise, the weight of what he had done bore down on him like a heavy chain. As the news of Obinna's death spread through the village, Kenichukwu withdrew further into himself. He avoided the elders, the villagers, and even his wife. And even as Obinna was buried, each of his hands was tied with a cloth as he attended the burial, looking so uncomfortable. Everywhere he went, he kept his hands hidden, as though afraid someone would see the stains. Even when his wife reached for his hand one evening, he pulled away sharply. "Don't touch me," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. She stared at him, hurt and confused, but he couldn't explain. How could he? How could he tell her the truth? Kenichukwu's guilt began to eat away at him. At night, he could hear Obinna's voice in the wind, calling his name. He saw his brother's face in every shadow, every dark corner of the room. The bloodstains on his hands seemed brighter, more vivid, as though accusing him of his sin. And then came the whispers, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Why, Kenichukwu? Why?" They followed him everywhere, even in broad daylight. He couldn't tell if they were real or just his guilt tormenting him, but they were enough to drive him to the brink of madness. The village elders called a meeting to discuss Obina's death. Kenichukwu knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. He couldn't hide forever. But for now, he kept his hands hidden, the bloodstains still sticking to his skin like a curse. The days after Obina's death were like a dark cloud over the village. His wife, Amaka, was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. Her 3 children, too young to fully understand what had happened, held onto her skirts, their small faces thin and hollow. There was no food, no money, and no hope. Amaka had always been a proud woman, but hunger has a way of humbling even the strongest hearts. One morning, her youngest child tugged at her wrapper. "Mama, I'm hungry," the boy whispered weakly. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him close. There was nothing to give him, no yams, no gari, not even a handful of groundnuts. The few neighbors who had helped her before were now tired of her begging. She could see it in their eyes whenever she knocked on their doors. Even the kindest among them had begun to avoid her. Amaka knew there was only one person in the village who had enough to help her and her children, Kenichukwu. She gathered her courage and went to his compound. The sight of his large house, surrounded by the large farm that had brought him so much wealth, filled her with bitterness. Her husband had helped Kenichukwu grow this farm. They had both worked under the scorching sun, planting and harvesting. Now, one was gone, and the other had turned his back on the family left behind. Amaka knocked softly on the wooden door. The first time she came, she waited for hours. No one answered. The second time, she tried calling his name, her voice breaking as she begged, "Brother Kenichukwu, please help us. Your brother's children are starving. I am begging you in the name of God." But Kenichukwu never came out. She knew he was inside. She could see the smoke rising from his kitchen and hear the faint sound of his footsteps behind the curtains. Still, he ignored her cries. On her 3rd visit, one of Kenichukwu's servants came to the door. "Auntie, please go home," the servant said, her face sympathetic but firm. "My boss says he cannot see you now." Amaka's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, wailing. "Does he not know that we are starving? Does he not care that his brother's children will die of hunger?" she cried. But the servant only shook her head and went back inside, leaving Amaka alone in her pain. Days turned into weeks, and Amaka grew weaker. Her children, once full of life, were now weak and tired. She began going to the market square to beg openly, something she had sworn she would never do. She would kneel before the traders, her hands outstretched, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Please, even if it's just a little yam peel or cassava, help me feed my children." Some gave her scraps out of pity. Others turned her away with harsh words. "Why don't you go and work?" one woman sneered. "You can't just sit and beg all day." Amaka wanted to scream, to tell them that she had worked, that she had toiled beside her husband for years. But what good would it do? Her husband was dead, and she was left with nothing. Every night, when the village grew quiet and the children finally fell asleep, Amaka would wrap herself in a shawl and walk to Obina's grave. It was a simple mound of earth at the edge of the bush, marked only by a small wooden cross. She would kneel there in the moonlight, her tears soaking the soil as she cried out her grief. "Obina, why did you leave me?" she would whisper, her voice trembling. "You promised me that we would grow old together, that our children would never know suffering. Why did you have to die? What will I tell our children when they ask for their father?" The night wind would rustle the leaves as if carrying her words to the heavens. Sometimes, she thought she could hear Obina's voice in the breeze, whispering her name. But when she looked around, there was only silence. One night, as Amaka knelt at the grave, she heard a rustling in the bushes. Fear gripped her, but she didn't move. What could she fear more than what she had already lost? If it was danger, perhaps it would end her suffering. But when she turned, there was nothing, just the swaying trees and the distant sound of crickets. She stayed longer that night, pouring out her heart. If only you were here, Obina. You would have fought for us. You would have found a way to feed us. But now I am alone. I have no strength left. Meanwhile, Kenichukwu was battling demons of his own. The bloodstains on his hands hadn't faded. Even after scrubbing them raw, he could still see the dark patches whenever he looked at his palms. Worse, the whispers followed him everywhere. During the day, he would hear faint voices calling, "Kenichukwu, why?" At night, his dreams were filled with Obina's face, staring at him with accusing eyes. When news of Amaka's suffering reached him again, he pretended not to hear. She will manage, he told himself, though deep down, he knew it wasn't true. Guilt gnawed at him like a rat chewing through wood. But he was too afraid to face her. What would he say? How could he admit what he had done? One evening, as Kenichukwu sat alone in his compound, one of his servants came to him. "Sir, I saw Madam Amaka begging in the market today," the servant said quietly. "It is not good. People are talking." Kenichukwu waved him away. "Leave me," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. But after the servant left, the words stayed with him. People were talking. How long before someone started asking questions? How long before the truth came out? He stood and left for his room, pacing, his mind racing. Maybe he should help her.